They bound her to the warrior no man dared to cross, until she found the secret he buried in silence. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The moon hung high over the desert as the night breeze whispered through the endless stretch of dry land. In the distance, a solitary figure trudged through the sand, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the vastness of the wilderness. She was a woman on the run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fear in her heart. For weeks, she had been escaping from a life she no longer wanted. But the harsh reality of the desert was as unforgiving as the people she had fled from. As the wind howled across the barren landscape, she stumbled, her body weak from exhaustion. She had been running for days, but every time she thought she had escaped, the shadows of her past seemed to follow her. She had no family, no home, and no hope left. All she had was the open desert and the fear that she was running out of time. That's when she saw him. In the dim light of the campfire, a tall figure stood watching her. His silhouette was imposing, like a statue carved from stone. He was a man of few words, his presence alone enough to send a shiver down her spine. His eyes were cold and calculating, yet there was something in them that hinted at a deeper truth. He was a warrior, one who had been to places she couldn't even begin to imagine, and yet there he was, standing before her, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. Without a word, he stepped forward, his powerful frame moving with the grace of a predator. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing her every move. But there was no anger in his eyes, only something darker, something that made her wonder if he was her salvation or her doom. "You are far from home," he said finally, his voice deep and rough, like gravel scraping against stone. She nodded, too exhausted to speak. He didn't ask any more questions, but his presence was enough. The fire crackled between them, the heat and light flickering in the darkness like the fragile hope she still clung to. What was this man doing here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around? Was he a hunter, a fugitive, or something else entirely? She had no idea, but as she watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something far more dangerous than the desert itself. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself drawn to him, even as every instinct told her to run. She didn't know why he had saved her, or why he was allowing her to stay by his fire. But there was one thing she knew for certain. Her life had just changed in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. Little did she know, the man standing before her was not just a warrior. He was a secret waiting to be uncovered, a man with a past buried so deep that even he didn't know how to escape it. And as the firelight danced on his face, she would soon learn that her survival was tied to the mystery he carried in silence. The night stretched on, and with it, the questions that would shape her future. Was she really safe with him? Or was she bound to something far darker than she could ever have imagined? The next morning, the desert stretched out endlessly before her. She woke to the sound of the wind rustling the dry earth and the warmth of the fire still crackling beside her. The warrior had already risen, his tall form silhouetted against the pale morning sky. He moved with the same fluidity and silence as he had the night before, his every step deliberate and measured. She sat up slowly, the weariness in her limbs reminding her of the brutal journey she had been on. But for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. A strange sense of safety hung in the air, though she couldn't quite place why. He hadn't spoken much since they'd met, but his presence had been a strange comfort, even in the silence. She watched him now, as he sharpened a knife with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. His eyes were focused, his jaw set in a way that made her wonder just how many battles he had fought, how many men had fallen before him. "Do you ever speak?" she asked, her voice rough from the dust of the desert and the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her chest. The warrior didn't look up at first, continuing his task as if she hadn't spoken. But then, his eyes lifted, locking with hers for the briefest of moments. "Only when necessary," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though he feared disturbing the vast emptiness around them. "Then, I suppose, I should be thankful you're speaking now, she replied, half joking but unsure if her words would reach him. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that resembled understanding. She wasn't sure how long they had been traveling together now. Days, maybe longer, but she had already learned that the warrior was a man of few words and even fewer answers. He lived with a quiet intensity, a silence that seemed to weigh on everything he did. He was not a man who welcomed questions, yet she had learned that his silence was not one of coldness, but of a burden too heavy for him to share. "Where are we headed?" she asked after a long pause, the need for answers beginning to gnaw at her. "To a place of safety," he replied, his tone final, leaving no room for further inquiry. It was the kind of answer that only raised more questions. A place of safety? She wasn't sure what that meant, but she wasn't in a position to argue. She had no choice but to follow, no other direction to go. The desert had no mercy for those who strayed from the path, and she knew she was only alive because of this mysterious warrior who had come to her rescue. They continued their journey through the unforgiving terrain, the sun climbing higher in the sky with each passing hour. By midday, the air was thick with heat, and she felt the weight of the day settle over her like a heavy cloak. They stopped for a brief rest, finding shelter beneath the sparse shade of a scraggly bush. She took a swig of water from the canteen he had offered her earlier, the cool liquid a relief against the burning thirst in her throat. As she drank, she watched him closely, trying to piece together the enigma that was this silent warrior. There was something about him that seemed almost out of place. His clothes were worn but practical, his weapons well-maintained, but there was an air of mystery surrounding him, a sense that he was far more than he appeared. He had saved her, yes, but there was a depth to him that she couldn't ignore, a past that was buried beneath layers of silence and scars. "How did you find me?" she asked, her curiosity growing despite herself. He glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the horizon. "I didn't find you," he said. "You found me." She frowned, confused by his words. "I don't understand." He sighed, a sound so soft she almost missed it. "In the desert, it's not about finding someone. It's about surviving long enough to be found." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She could feel the weight of them pressing down on her chest, but she didn't know how to respond. It was clear that there was something more to this man, something buried deep within him, and she wasn't sure if she would ever learn the truth. But she knew one thing for certain. He was the only reason she was still alive, and the mystery of his past was now a part of her own story. As the day wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the warrior turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We move at night," he said. "It's safer that way." She nodded, knowing better than to argue. The desert could be deadly, and every moment of safety was a gift. They packed up their camp in silence, each movement a routine they had fallen into without words. She didn't know where they were going, or what would happen when they reached this place of safety he had spoken of, but she trusted him. For now, that was enough. As the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, they began their journey once again. The heat of the day had subsided, but the air was still thick with the lingering weight of the desert. The warrior moved ahead, his strides sure and steady, as though he knew the path without needing to see it. She followed closely behind, her mind still spinning with the mysterious words he had spoken earlier. In the quiet of the evening, with nothing but the sound of their footsteps and the whisper of the wind, she couldn't help but wonder about the man she was following. There was something about him that both intrigued and unsettled her. His silence had never been more deafening, and she found herself yearning for some clue, some explanation that might shed light on his past. But the warrior remained elusive, a shadow moving in the dark. As the night grew deeper, the stars above them became sharper, more brilliant against the endless black sky. She could feel the weight of the silence between them, a tension that seemed to grow with every step. She was no longer afraid of the desert. She was afraid of the man who guided her through it. The campfire had long since burned down to embers, and they walked on in the cold, the distance between them growing with each passing moment. After what felt like hours, the warrior finally stopped, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. She caught up with him, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to her, his face hard as stone. "We're close," he said, his voice low and steady. "Close to what?" she asked, but the words died on her lips as he reached for something at his side. With one fluid motion, he drew his sword, the gleaming steel catching the moonlight. "Stay behind me," he said, his tone no longer a suggestion, but a command. She stepped back, her heart racing. She had no idea what they were about to face, but the look in his eyes told her that whatever it was something she could not confront alone. The warrior moved forward, his steps silent but swift. The desert was still, too still. As they approached a ridge, she could see the outline of something in the distance, something moving. She couldn't make out what it was, but the warrior didn't hesitate. He kept his eyes on the shadow, his sword raised, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. They moved closer, and the figure became clearer. It was another man, a tall figure draped in tattered robes, his face obscured by a hood. He stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of the desert below. For a moment, the two men stood motionless, as if recognizing one another in the silence of the night. Then, without a word, the hooded man turned and stepped into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The warrior's grip on his sword loosened, and he lowered it slightly. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The warrior didn't answer immediately. He only stared into the darkness, his gaze distant. "A ghost from the past," he said finally, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, anger, perhaps both. He turned back toward her, his expression hardening. "We need to keep moving," he said. "It's not safe to linger here." She didn't question him, not this time. She followed him without a word, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving, and for the first time, she realized that the warrior wasn't just protecting her from the dangers of the desert. He was protecting her from something far more dangerous, the demons of his own past. They walked for what felt like hours, the landscape changing as they moved deeper into the heart of the desert. The dry, cracked earth beneath their feet began to give way to softer sand, the dunes rising and falling like waves on a vast ocean. They came to a small oasis, the first sign of life she had seen in days. A stream of clear water ran through the center, surrounded by a few sparse trees. The warrior led her to the water's edge, his eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. "This is where we rest," he said, "but we don't stay long." She knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. The coolness of the water was a welcome relief, but the taste of it only served to remind her how long it had been since she had felt truly safe. The warrior stood nearby, his eyes never leaving the horizon. It was then that she noticed something. In the distance, on the edge of the oasis, there was a figure, a woman, standing still, watching them. The woman's clothes were tattered, her face hidden by a scarf, but there was no mistaking the look in her eyes. She was afraid, but there was also something else, something that made her look familiar. She could not place it, but something in her made her heart skip a beat. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The warrior didn't answer. He only stepped forward, his sword drawn once more. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, she could feel the danger that surrounded them. The past was catching up with them, and there was no escaping it. The woman stood motionless, her eyes locked on the warrior. There was something in the way she stared at him, something that made the air thick with tension. The warrior's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw it. Instead, he took a step forward, his face unreadable. The woman did not move, nor did she speak. It was as if they were both caught in a moment frozen in time, the desert around them holding its breath. The warrior's eyes narrowed, scanning her figure. She was tall, with dark, weathered skin, and a scarf wrapped tightly around her face, only her eyes visible. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of his memory, but he could not place it. He felt the stirrings of an old, forgotten pain, but he buried it deep. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice steady but guarded. The woman remained silent for a long moment, her gaze never wavering. Then, she spoke, her voice low and hoarse, as though she had not used it in years. "I'm the one you left behind." The words hit him like a fist to the chest. He froze, his grip tightening on his sword as the weight of her words sank in. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if he feared the answer. She lowered her scarf just enough to reveal the lower half of her face. Her lips were cracked and dry from the desert's unforgiving heat, but it was the eyes that spoke volumes. I am the one who survived, the one you thought was lost. His breath caught in his throat, his mind racing to place her, to remember what had happened. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be dead. The memories flooded back like a storm. Faces, names, and places long forgotten, but one memory stood out above all others. A raid, a fire, a massacre. He had been forced to leave. He had left her behind, thinking she had perished in the flames. And now, here she was, standing before him, alive. You should have stayed away, he said, his voice thick with guilt and regret. The woman's eyes softened for a moment, but then they hardened again. I couldn't. I've been searching for you ever since. To finish what we started. The warrior's heart pounded in his chest, the old wounds of his past reopening with a vengeance. He took a step back, his mind torn between the past and the present. The woman had been a part of his life once, someone he had cared for, someone he had lost. But he had no place for her in his world now. His world had changed, and he had changed with it. There is no more we, he said, his voice cold, harder than he intended. There is only survival. The woman's face twisted in a mixture of anger and pain. You're wrong, she said, her voice rising. There is still a fight left in you, in both of us. I can see it in your eyes. The warrior turned away, unwilling to face her, unwilling to confront the past that had shaped him. But as he moved, the words she had spoken echoed in his mind. A fight left in both of them? Could that be true? Had he truly given up everything? He couldn't answer her, not yet. Not while the memories were still too fresh, too painful. I can't do this, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I can't go back. The woman stepped forward, her voice low and insistent. You don't have to, but you can't keep running from what you've done. You owe it to yourself to face it. For a moment, the warrior stood still, caught between the woman and his past. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had always believed that the past should be buried, forgotten, but now it seemed that it would. Never let him go. With a heavy sigh, he turned to face her once more. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman met his gaze without hesitation. I want you to remember who you were, and to understand what you've become. The warrior said nothing. His eyes, once cold and distant, softened ever so slightly, as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting to be forced to face the truth of who he was. The woman stepped back, giving him space, but the air between them crackled with an undeniable tension. The warrior knew he could not avoid the confrontation any longer. The past had caught up with him, and now he would have to face the choices he had made, the people he had abandoned. He looked to the woman, the ghost from his past, and nodded once, a silent agreement between them. She did not smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, perhaps. She had found him, and now the real battle would begin. The woman's words hung in the air like a heavy mist, settling between them and weighing down the space. The warrior stood silently, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand whether this confrontation was real or a nightmare he had long since buried. He had not expected her, this figure from his past, to reappear, and the truth of her presence gnawed at him, threatening to tear apart the carefully constructed walls he had built over the years. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night stretched on, the stillness of the desert making it impossible to ignore the tension that had settled between them. Finally, the warrior broke the silence, his voice rough, as if he had not used it in a long time. What do you want from me? He repeated, this time with less certainty. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his, and spoke with quiet intensity. I want you to face what you've done, she said, her voice carrying a weight he could not ignore. I want you to see the man you once were, and the man you've become. He felt a shudder run through him at her words, and for a moment, he thought he might turn away from her again. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the look in her eyes, or maybe it was the fact that, deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent so many years running, burying the past, hoping it would never catch up with him. But now, standing face to face with it, he couldn't escape it any longer. His past was staring him in the face, and he had no choice but to confront it. I thought I left all that behind, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman shook her head. You can't leave it behind, she said. It's a part of you. It always will be. The words stung, but they were true. He had tried to forget the people he had once cared for, the things he had done. But every time he thought he could move forward, the shadows of his past found a way to follow him. And now, here she was, reminding him of everything he had tried to forget. I never wanted this, he said, his tone shifting, anger flickering in his chest. I didn't want any of it. She took another step closer, her presence strong and steady. But you didn't stop it either, she replied, her voice soft but firm. You left, and you let it happen. You can't hide from that. The warrior looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He had left, yes. He had walked away from everything. The people, the bloodshed, the betrayal, but it didn't matter how far he ran. The guilt would always follow. And the woman before him, this ghost from his past, was the reminder he couldn't escape. I had no choice, he said, almost to himself. I couldn't stay. Her expression softened, but only slightly. Maybe not. But you chose survival over everything else. The words hit him harder than he expected. They cut through the walls he had built, exposing the raw truth he had long since buried. He had chosen survival, not just for himself, but for the few people who had survived with him. He had abandoned the rest. His hand clenched around the hilt of his sword, the weight of his past crashing down on him. The woman watched him carefully, sensing his inner struggle. And what about now? She asked. What do you choose now? He stood there for a moment, the question hanging in the air, suffocating him. He didn't know the answer. He had spent so many years hiding from his past, from the choices he had made, that now, when it came time to face them, he didn't know where to start. But as he looked at her, this woman who had survived what he thought was impossible, he realized something. He had been running for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to stand still, to confront what was in front of him. The woman had found him, yes, but she had also found the man he used to be, the man he had forgotten. The warrior took a deep breath, his mind racing. The woman had spoken the truth. He couldn't escape his past. But maybe, just maybe, he could face it. The choice was his now, and it was up to him whether he would continue running or stop and fight. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who had fought for something greater than survival. He looked at the woman once more, meeting her gaze, and for the first time in years, he didn't look away. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice steady, though his heart was still heavy with the weight of everything he had left behind. The woman's eyes softened, a faint glimmer of hope in them. I want you to come with me, she said. I want you to remember who you were, and what you still have to fight for. The words were simple, but they struck him deeply. He had forgotten what it was like to fight for something more than just survival. He had forgotten what it was like to have a purpose. And now, standing here in the desert, with this woman before him, he felt that purpose stirring once more. I will, he said quietly, the resolve in his voice growing stronger. I will fight. And for the first time in years, the warrior felt like he might finally be able to face the past he had been running from. He turned away from the woman, taking a few steps toward the desert ahead. The path was uncertain, and he didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. The warrior stood motionless, the desert stretching out before him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. The woman had given him a choice. He could either face his past, the one he had tried so desperately to bury, or continue living in the shadow of his own regret. But there was something else, something in the air between them, that made him realize the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption. He had long since lost track of time, but now, as the cool night air settled around them, he knew that his decision was no longer a matter of simply escaping. He turned to face her, his voice low but steady. I'm ready, he said, though the weight of his words didn't feel like his own. They had spent so much time in silence, but now, for the first time in years, it felt as though the silence between them was finally breaking. She nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that gave him hope. Then let's go, she said softly. Together, they began to move, the path ahead uncertain, but the weight of their shared journey making the steps feel lighter. They walked deeper into the desert, the moon above them their only light. The warrior kept his eyes on the horizon, but he couldn't help but feel the pull of his past, the ghosts of the choices he had made haunting him with every step. They had walked for what seemed like hours when they came upon a small camp, an oasis hidden in the heart of the desert. The water glistened in the dim light, a stark contrast to the dry, cracked earth that stretched for miles around them. It was a place that felt like a sanctuary, a place to stop and rest, but the warrior knew they couldn't stay for long. The woman stepped forward, kneeling by the water, her reflection rippling across the surface. She seemed at peace, but there was an edge to her, something that told him she was far from content. "Do you think we're safe here?" she asked, her voice a mixture of hope and doubt. The warrior watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Safe?" he echoed. "I'm not sure any of us are ever truly safe. But it's the only place. We can rest for now." She looked at him, studying his face as if searching for something more. "What happens after this?" she asked, her tone hesitant. He didn't answer right away. He had spent so many years fighting, running, and surviving. But now, for the first time in a long time, he found himself unsure of the next step. He had never considered a future beyond the next fight, the next escape. But now, with her by his side, he felt something shift within him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. "We keep moving forward," he said, his voice quieter this time, more certain. "One step at a time." She nodded, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was a small thing, but it made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something more. As the night stretched on, they sat by the fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the sand. The warrior found himself lost in thought, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. The memories of the people he had lost, the lives he had taken, all of it flooded back in waves. He had tried to move on, to forget, but the truth was, he couldn't. Not anymore. The woman had given him a chance to face it, to confront the choices he had made. But there was still a part of him that resisted, a part of him that wanted to turn away, to run. But as he looked across the fire at her, he knew he couldn't do that anymore. He had to face the man he had become. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The woman looked at him, her gaze steady. "You don't have to forgive yourself," she said, her words firm but gentle. "But you do have to face what you've done. And that's the first step." He didn't answer right away, but the weight of her words settled in his chest. She was right. He couldn't run from his past forever. But for the first time, he felt like he might be able to change, to do something good, something that would matter. The night stretched on, the stars above them like tiny beacons in the vast darkness. The warrior sat quietly, the firelight dancing in his eyes. As he thought about the future, he didn't know what it held, or if he was ready for what was to come, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. The woman beside him had given him a chance to fight for something greater than survival. And for the first time in a long time, the warrior felt the stirrings of hope. As the fire burned low, they fell into a quiet, shared understanding. The past was a heavy burden, but it was one they would face together. The warrior didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. The morning came quietly, the soft hues of dawn breaking over the horizon. The desert was calm, almost eerily so, as though it were waiting for something. The warrior stood at the edge of the small oasis, his gaze fixed on the far distance. The woman stood beside him, her eyes also scanning the barren landscape. But there was a stillness in her expression, a calmness that matched the warrior's own. They had shared a quiet night by the fire, the only sounds the crackling of the flames and the soft rustle of the desert wind. There had been little conversation between them since their decision to keep moving forward together, but neither had felt the need for words. It was as though the unspoken understanding between them was enough. The warrior knew the time had come to leave this place of temporary refuge. He could feel it in his bones. They couldn't stay here long. The past was catching up with them, and the desert was a place where nothing could remain hidden forever. "We need to move," the warrior said, his voice low and steady, the words carrying a weight that felt heavier than the dawn itself. She looked at him, nodding silently, her expression unreadable. She had never asked where they were going, and she hadn't questioned his silence, trusting him as much as she trusted herself. But now, as the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. The warrior met her gaze, his eyes dark with the burden of his own thoughts. "We're going to face what's ahead," he replied simply though. The words felt like a challenge. "There is no running from it anymore." She said nothing for a moment, processing his words. The truth was, she had known that this was coming. She had known that there was no future in running, that at some point, they would have to confront whatever lay ahead, together. But the reality of it, the weight of what they were about to face, still hung heavy in the air. "And what do we face?" she asked, her eyes searching his. The warrior turned away, scanning the distance once more, his expression hardening. "We face those who would destroy everything we've fought for," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet rage. "The people who think they can control us, who think they can erase what we've done." The woman's heart beat faster at his words, the fear that she had pushed aside coming back in full force. But there was something else too, a resolve. She had faced dangers before, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something bigger, something worth fighting for. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on the warrior's back. "I'm with you," she said, her voice unwavering. The warrior turned to face her, his eyes softening ever so slightly. He didn't say anything in response, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Together, they would face what was coming. Together, they would fight. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them as they began their journey once again. The oasis was now just a distant memory, the only reminder of the brief moment of peace they had shared. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and the warrior knew that the road ahead would be filled with dangers, both known and unknown. But it was a road they would walk together. The journey stretched on, the days blurring into one another as they pushed forward through the desert. The warrior had grown accustomed to the solitude, but now, with the woman by his side, the silence felt different. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It was comfortable. They didn't need words to understand each other. Every glance, every movement, spoke volumes. As they traveled, the woman learned more about the warrior, his past, the battles he had fought, the people he had lost, and the choices that had shaped him. But he never shared everything. There were things he kept locked away, hidden deep inside. She didn't press him for answers. She knew that some wounds ran too deep to be healed by mere words. But every once in a while, she caught a glimpse of the man he had once been, a man who had cared, a man who had hoped for something more. And that man was still in there, buried beneath the hardened exterior of the warrior who had come to life in the desert. As the days wore on, they came across signs of others, footprints in the sand, remnants of camps long abandoned, and sometimes the distant echoes of voices carried by the wind. But they never encountered anyone. The desert was empty, vast, and silent. The warrior had chosen this path for a reason, but it was clear that whatever lay ahead was still waiting for them. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. The night before they reached their destination, the warrior spoke for the first time in days. "Tomorrow, we face what we've been running from." The woman turned to him, her gaze steady. "And if we fail?" she asked. The warrior's lips parted slightly, as though he was about to say something, but then he paused. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "We won't fail," he said quietly. And though the words were simple, they held a weight that neither of them could deny. In that moment, the woman realized that no matter what happened, they had come this far together. And together, they would face whatever the desert had in store for them. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, casting a pale orange light over the horizon, and the desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving. The warrior and the woman stood at the edge of a cliff, their eyes fixed on the path that lay ahead. They had made it through the night without incident, but the silence between them now felt heavier, as if the weight of their journey was beginning to press down on both of them. The warrior's eyes scanned the land below, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. But the desert was still, its vast emptiness only broken by the occasional gust of wind that stirred the dry sand. The woman, though quiet, felt the same unease settling in her chest. They had come so far, but now the real test awaited them. What if they failed? What if they weren't strong enough to face whatever was coming? "Do you think they're waiting for us?" she asked, breaking the silence, her voice a soft whisper against the harsh wind. The warrior's gaze remained steady. "They're always waiting," he replied, his voice low, betraying no emotion. He spoke with the certainty of a man who had seen too many battles, too many faces in the dark. "But we're ready." The woman didn't know if she believed him, but she didn't argue. There was something in his voice that gave her hope, a quiet confidence that had been earned over years of surviving in a world that offered little mercy. They had faced their demons, both of them, in the silence of the desert. Now, they were approaching the reckoning. She had come to realize that the warrior was not just a protector, but a man who had been broken by the same world he had fought to survive in. And yet, he kept moving forward, kept fighting, even when everything in him must have screamed to give up. She admired him for that, more than she could express. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter this time, as she stepped closer to him. The warrior turned to her, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "Now, we face them," he said simply, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. It wouldn't be easy, and they would have to fight for every inch of ground. But she had come to understand that this was the only way forward. She couldn't go back to the life she had before, and neither could he. The past was a shadow that would always follow them, but the present was theirs to shape. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon below, and they began their descent. The journey was slow, the path treacherous and narrow, but they moved with purpose, each step carrying them closer to whatever awaited them. The warrior led the way, his movements fluid and sure. He didn't look back, but the woman kept pace with him, her eyes scanning the landscape, ever watchful. They had been walking for hours when they came upon a narrow pass between two jagged cliffs. The warrior stopped abruptly, his hand raised in a signal for silence. The woman froze, her heart pounding as she instinctively reached for the knife at her side. They were close now. She could feel it. The warrior's eyes darted to the left and right, searching the shadows. She followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Just the wind, whispering through the rocks. "They're here," the warrior said quietly, his voice sharp with focus. The woman's breath caught in her throat, her senses on high alert. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The warrior didn't answer. Instead, he moved forward, his sword drawn, his body tense with anticipation. She followed him, her steps cautious but steady. As they reached the center of the pass, the sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow space. The warrior's hand tightened on his sword, and the woman's heart skipped a beat. She could hear them now, soft, deliberate steps, moving in sync with their own. "They're closing in," the warrior muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Get ready." The woman's hand went to the hilt of her own weapon, her fingers trembling. She had faced danger before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now, and there was no room for failure. They had no choice but to face whatever came their way. The first shadow appeared in the distance, a figure cloaked in dark robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. The warrior stepped forward, his sword raised, his body poised to strike. The woman stayed close behind him, her breath steady, her focus sharp. The figure moved toward them, its steps slow but deliberate, until it was within striking distance. "You shouldn't have come," the warrior said, his voice cold and hard. The figure stopped, raising its hands in a gesture of surrender. "We didn't come to fight," a voice said from beneath the hood. "We came to end this." The woman tensed, her hand still gripping the knife at her side. She didn't trust them, not yet. The warrior's eyes flickered with recognition, his stance softening just slightly. "End it?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" The figure lowered its hood, revealing the face of a man the warrior had not seen in years. It was a face he never thought he would see again, a face from his past, from a life he had tried to forget. The woman glanced at the warrior, noticing the change in his expression. He knew this man. The air between them grew thick with tension, and for a moment, no one spoke. The man's lips parted as though to say something, but the warrior was the first to speak. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with years of regret. "But it seems we have no choice." The woman stood silently, watching the interaction unfold, her heart racing as she realized that the past was about to collide with the present in a way none of them could have predicted. The warrior stood frozen, staring at the man before him, his mind racing, every instinct screaming to draw his sword. But he couldn't move. The face in front of him was one he thought he had left behind forever. It was a face from a time long past, a time he had tried to forget, but now it was standing before him. The years of separation and pain etched in every line of the man's weathered face. "You should not have come here," the warrior said, his voice strained, the weight of the past heavy on his chest. The man before him didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret or perhaps guilt. "I had no choice," the man said, his voice low, but the words carried a burden. The warrior's eyes narrowed, his grip on his sword tightening, but he remained still. "No choice," the warrior repeated, his tone bitter. "You had a choice once, but you chose to leave. You chose to abandon us." The man lowered his gaze, as though the words struck deeper than any blade could. "I did what I thought was best," the man said, almost apologetically. "But now I see the cost of that choice." The warrior stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "The cost?" he repeated with a laugh that held no humor. "The cost is everything. The people we lost. The lives we destroyed. The ones who still suffer because of your choices. You think you can just waltz back in here and pretend it all means nothing?" The man's expression flickered, but he didn't speak right away. He was silent for a long moment, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps gathering the courage to say what had been on his mind for years. "I came here to make amends," the man said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I know I can never undo the past, but I can try to make it right. I owe it to those we left behind." The warrior stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "Make it right?" he asked, his voice rising in anger. "There is no making it right. We can't undo what's been done. The lives that were taken, the families that were destroyed. You think a few words can fix that?" The man held his ground, his gaze steady. "I know that nothing can undo the damage we've caused. But I've spent years living with that guilt, and I can't carry it anymore. I need to do something, even if it's small, to make up for what I did." The warrior's sword lowered slightly, his anger beginning to fade, replaced by something else. It was hard to admit, but a part of him understood. He had carried his own burdens for years, the weight of his choices constantly on his mind. "And what do you expect from me?" the warrior asked, his voice quieter now. "I don't expect forgiveness," the man replied. "I just need to make sure that what happened doesn't happen again, that we don't lose any more." The warrior stood there for a long moment, considering the man's words. The past was never something he had been able to escape, and perhaps, like the man in front of him, he needed to face it head on. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could still fight for a future that was different. "You're asking for a chance," the warrior said finally. The man nodded, a sense of hope flickering in his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A chance to make things right." The warrior studied him for a long moment, his mind racing through the years of hurt, anger, and regret. Could he give this man another chance? Could he allow himself to trust someone who had once abandoned him and the people they had sworn to protect? He looked over at the woman standing behind him. She had been silent through the exchange, her eyes focused on the man, her expression unreadable. She had trusted him when no one else would, and now, for the first time, the warrior realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to extend that trust to someone else. He let out a long breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," the warrior said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I will give you a chance. I'll fight beside you, if you're willing to prove that you're truly ready to make things right." The man's face softened with gratitude, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with relief. The warrior turned to the woman beside him. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them. She nodded, her expression softening, and without a word, she stepped forward to stand beside him. Together, they looked back at the man, and the warrior knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but it was a path they would walk together. The past had shaped them, but it would not define them. "We fight for the future," the warrior said, his voice steady. "And we do it together." The man nodded, the weight of the moment not lost on him. He had been given a second chance, but it was up to him to prove that he was worthy of it. And for the first time in years, the warrior felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make things right. As they continued their journey, The weight of the warriors' decision lingered in the air. The tension between them had lifted, but the path ahead remained uncertain. They had made their choices, and now they were moving forward together. The past was no longer something to run from, but a part of them they would have to confront and move past if they were to have any hope of a future. The desert stretched before them, vast and empty, as if mocking their resolve. It was a place where the heat could break even the strongest of wills, where every step felt like an eternity. Yet there was something liberating in the vastness, something that allowed them to breathe, even as they were hunted by their own histories. The warrior's thoughts were clouded with the remnants of his past. Even though he had agreed to fight alongside the man from his past, the scars of betrayal, the people lost, still clung to him like a shadow. But there was a part of him, buried deep inside, that was starting to believe they could make a difference, that they could change something in this unforgiving world. They were walking towards something, a destiny they had yet to understand, but together, they would face whatever awaited them. The woman walked silently by his side, her eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any sign of movement. She had seen the warrior's internal battle, the way he carried the weight of his past like a stone in his chest. But she also saw the quiet determination in his eyes, a flicker of hope that had been reignited. She knew that this was a fight that would demand everything from them, but she also knew they were ready. They had no other choice. They continued their journey, the days blending together as they moved deeper into the desert. The landscape began to change, the dry, cracked earth giving way to rough, rocky terrain. The air grew colder, the winds picking up, and the warriors' senses heightened. It was as if the desert itself was warning them, urging them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. The man who had once betrayed them had joined their ranks, and together they would face the reckoning. They were nearing the end of their journey, and as the days passed, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The desert was vast, yes, but it was never truly empty. There were eyes in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We're close," the warrior muttered one night as they sat around the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows on their faces. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the edge of determination in his words. "Tomorrow, we confront what's been hunting us." The woman looked at him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The warrior looked toward the dark horizon, his eyes narrowing. "I mean we face the ones who think they can break us," he said. "The ones who have been waiting for this moment." She felt a shiver run through her as the weight of his words sank in. There was no denying the danger that awaited them. The man who had joined them, the one from the warrior's past, had been quiet since their conversation, but now he looked up, his expression grim. "They're not far," he said, his voice low. "We need to be ready." The woman glanced at him, sensing the unease in his words. She had never trusted him completely, not after everything that had happened, but she knew he was right. The battle that awaited them was unlike anything they had faced before. The warrior's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen before. Not just the hardened fighter, but a man who had finally accepted that he could not run any longer. He had made peace with the past, and now he was ready to fight for the future. "We fight together," the warrior said, his voice strong, unyielding. "We don't let the past define us anymore." The woman nodded, a sense of resolve filling her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had made her peace with the choices she had made, and now she was ready to face whatever came next. They gathered their belongings and prepared to move out at dawn. The night was cold, but the fire between them kept them warm. The warrior, the woman, and the man from the past, they were all bound together now, whether by choice or fate, but they knew one thing: they would fight. The sun rose the next day, casting a golden light over the landscape, and they began the final leg of their journey. As they approached the place they had been heading toward, the air grew tense. There was something in the silence that spoke louder than any words could. The desert had never felt so alive, so full of anticipation. Every step they took brought them closer to the confrontation they had all been waiting for, and the warrior knew that there would be no turning back. The reckoning was at hand. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when they arrived at the old fortress, the place that had haunted the warriors past for so long. The structure loomed before them, a crumbling monument to what had once been a place of power and control. The wind whispered through the broken walls, carrying with it the echoes of a time long gone. And yet, the warrior could feel its weight pressing on him as though it was still alive, still watching. The woman moved silently by his side, her eyes narrowed, ever alert, but her calm demeanor betrayed nothing of the tension that simmered in her chest. She could feel the magnitude of the moment, the sense of finality in the air. This was the place where it all began, where the lines between friend and enemy had been drawn, where loyalties had been tested and shattered. She glanced at the warrior, his face hardened, his eyes cold, but there was something else beneath the surface, something she couldn't name, but it was there, just waiting to break free. The man from their past walked a few steps ahead, his face set with determination, but the woman noticed the stiffness in his posture, the way he seemed to hold his breath, as if every step was another reminder of what they were about to face. The warrior had been silent for most of the journey, but now, standing at the threshold of the fortress, he spoke. "We're not just here to fight. We're here to end it, once and for all." His words were a simple statement, but they carried the weight of years of regret, of choices made in haste, and lives lost in the process. The woman didn't say anything. She understood. They had all come to terms with the past, but facing it again, in this place, was different. This was where the ghosts would come to life. The warrior stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. He didn't draw it, but there was a sense of readiness in his movements. The air felt thick with tension as they entered the ruins. The structure was vast, the stone walls towering above them, their surfaces covered in dust and moss, remnants of a time when this place had been a fortress of strength. Now, it was a hollow shell, the echoes of its past reverberating through every step they took. As they made their way deeper into the heart of the fortress, the woman couldn't help but feel the weight of the history that hung in the air. This was not just a physical battle they were about to face. It was a battle for their souls, for their very futures. And as they ventured further into the darkness, she could sense the ghosts of the past watching them. "They're here," the man from the past said suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. The warrior turned to him, his eyes hardening. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The man nodded, his eyes flicking toward the shadows ahead. "I've felt them for years," he said. "They never left." The warrior didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Every instinct told him they were being watched, that every corner of this place was alive with the presence of those who would not forgive, those who would not forget. They moved in silence, their footsteps echoing off the walls, the air thick with the sense of impending danger. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the structure as it shifted in the wind. Then, without warning, a voice called out from the darkness. "You should not have come back." The warrior's hand immediately went to his sword, but he didn't draw it yet. He recognized the voice, and the weight of it caused a knot to form in his stomach. He knew exactly who it was. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and imposing, its face hidden beneath a hood. The warrior's eyes narrowed. "You always did think you could control everything," he said, his voice cold. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face the warrior had hoped to never see again. It was the leader of the faction that had once been his own, the man who had betrayed him, the one who had set in motion the chain of events that had torn their world apart. The woman tensed beside the warrior, sensing the intensity of the situation. She didn't know the full history between them, but she could feel the weight of the animosity between the warrior and this man. The leader's eyes gleamed with something darker now, something far more dangerous than she had imagined. "You think you've come here for redemption?" The leader sneered. "You think you can undo everything you've done? You'll never escape your fate." The warrior's hand tightened on his sword. He had heard these words before, but this time they carried no weight. "I'm not here to undo the past," the warrior said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure it ends." The leader laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You really think you can stop this? You're nothing but a shadow of the man you once were." The warrior stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "Maybe I am, but I'm still standing, and I'm not leaving until this ends." The leader's expression faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. The warrior's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, the past, the betrayals, and the battles were no longer the focus. It was about the present, about the choices they were making now. The warrior's hand moved swiftly, drawing his sword in a flash, the steel gleaming in the dim light. "This ends now," he said, and the silence that followed was deafening. The leader's mocking laugh echoed off the crumbling walls, the sound bouncing around the empty fortress like a challenge. The warrior's grip tightened on his sword, his knuckles white against the hilt. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would either break him or finally give him the peace he had sought for so long. The leader stood there, smug and unyielding, but the warrior knew better than to underestimate him. His enemy had always been a master of manipulation, a man who could twist words and bend minds to his will. But today, that power meant nothing. The warrior was no longer the man who had been controlled by fear and doubt. He had faced the worst of himself, and now, he was ready to fight for what was right. "You still don't get it, do you?" The leader sneered, taking a step closer, his eyes glinting with malice. "You think your little rebellion will change anything? You're nothing but a broken soldier who ran from his duty." The warrior's eyes flared with anger at the man's words, but he remained silent, refusing to let the taunts draw him in. This was not the time for words. This was the time for action. Without warning, the warrior lunged forward, his sword slicing through the air with deadly precision. The leader barely had time to react, raising his own weapon in defense. The sound of metal clashing rang out, sharp and unforgiving. The woman stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her eyes locked on the two men, her body tense with anticipation. This was the moment they had all feared, the final confrontation, the reckoning that would decide their fates. The leader's sword met the warrior's with a loud clash, sparks flying from the contact. For a moment, the two men were locked in a deadly dance, each testing the other's strength, each pushing for dominance. The warrior's every movement was calculated, precise. He had trained for this moment for years, and now, every ounce of that training was coming to life. But the leader was no slouch. He was a skilled fighter, just as ruthless and determined as the warrior. They fought in silence, the only sound the clash of steel, the rhythmic pounding of their feet on the stone floor. Sweat dripped from their brows as the battle raged on, neither willing to yield. The woman watched in silence, her hands clenched at her sides. She had never seen the warrior fight like this before. There was a fury in him, a fire that she had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. She knew this fight wasn't just for their survival. It was personal. The leader's sword came down in a brutal arc, aiming for the warrior's neck, but the warrior was ready. He dodged the blow with a swift roll to the side, then spun to face his opponent, his sword flashing in the dim light. The leader's eyes widened in surprise as the warrior's blade cut through the air, landing a blow to his arm. The leader staggered back, a curse escaping his lips as he clutched his bleeding arm. The warrior pressed forward, not giving him a moment to recover. "This ends now," the warrior growled, his voice low and filled with a primal fury. The leader, realizing the tide had turned, growled in frustration and desperation. He lashed out with his sword, but the warrior was faster. With a swift motion, the warrior sidestepped, then delivered a decisive strike to the leader's chest, knocking him to the ground. The man let out a strangled gasp, his sword clattering to the stone floor as he crumpled beneath the force of the blow. The woman took a step forward, her eyes wide, watching as the warrior stood over the fallen man. She had seen this side of him before, the side that was capable of incredible strength and unwavering determination. But now, there was something different. There was a finality in his movements, a sense that he had reached the end of a long journey, one that had been fraught with pain and regret. The leader struggled to rise, but the warrior stepped forward, pressing the tip of his sword to the man's throat. The air was thick with tension as the two men locked eyes, their faces inches apart. "Do you finally understand?" the warrior asked, his voice cold, devoid of any emotion. The leader's lips curled into a bitter smile, despite the blood pooling beneath him. "You think this is over?" he spat, his breath ragged. "You're wrong. It never ends." The warrior's expression hardened. "It ends today," he said firmly. The leader's defiance faltered, and in that moment, the warrior knew. He had finally conquered his own past, and with it, the man who had haunted him for so long. The leader's gaze softened, but only for a moment, before the light, and his eyes faded. The woman stepped forward now, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's over," she said, her words cutting through the tension. The warrior nodded, lowering his sword. He didn't need to say anything more. This was the moment they had fought for, the moment when the past was finally laid to rest. The woman turned away, her heart heavy, but there was a sense of peace settling within her. They had fought together, and now, they were one step closer to moving forward. The warrior stood for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fallen leader. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The battle was over. The past was behind them, and for the first time in years, they could begin to look toward the future. The warrior stood in the silence of the crumbling fortress, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. The battle was over. The man who had once been a part of his life, a man who had once been a friend, now lay defeated at his feet. The past, with all its ghosts and regrets, had been confronted, and in that confrontation, the warrior had found something unexpected: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from victory or the end of a battle. It was the quiet peace that came from knowing that the path ahead, though uncertain, was theirs to walk. The woman stood beside him, her eyes soft but determined. She had fought beside him, just as she had promised, and now, together, they had faced the storm that had haunted them both. The warrior could feel the weight of her presence beside him, a constant reminder that they were not alone, that no matter what came next, they had each other. The man from their past had said his final words before the warrior had struck the decisive blow. He had tried to make amends, but the warrior knew that no amount of words or promises could undo the damage that had been done. The betrayal, the lives lost, and the scars that marked both their souls could never be erased. Yet, in that final moment, the warrior had understood something. He had understood that true redemption wasn't about undoing the past. It was about facing it, accepting it, and moving forward despite it. As they turned to leave the ruins, the warrior felt the burden of years of conflict finally beginning to lift. The desert stretched out before them, vast and open, with no more shadows lurking at their heels. They had cleared the last hurdle, and now it was time to forge a new path. "It's done," the woman said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet satisfaction. The warrior nodded but said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew what this moment meant. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her gaze shifting toward the horizon. The warrior paused, his eyes scanning the land before them. The future was an unknown, but for the first time, he was willing to embrace it. "We go wherever the road takes us," he said, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of something new in it: hope. The woman smiled, and for the first time, the warrior felt something shift within him. It wasn't just the weight of the past that had been lifted, it was the realization that the future could be something more. They had faced the darkness, and now they were walking toward the light. Together, as they walked away from the fortress, their footsteps steady and sure, the warrior couldn't help but feel the winds of change blowing through the desert. It was a new beginning, and the path ahead, though uncertain, was theirs to choose. They had fought for their survival, but now they would fight for something more. For a future, for redemption, and for the chance to build something lasting. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but it was also full of possibilities. With each step they took, the warrior felt the chains of his past slowly begin to fade. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that fortress all those days ago. He had changed, and he knew that no matter what happened next, the change was what mattered most. The woman beside him was proof of that, proof that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a chance for light. As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the sand, the warrior and the woman continued forward. The world was wide open, and they were ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would write their own story, a story not defined by the past, but shaped by the choices they made in the present. And for the first time, the warrior believed that the future could be different. It was a story they would build, one step at a time. In this gripping tale set in the heart of the American frontier, a warrior and a woman bound by their past find themselves facing their greatest fears and most dangerous enemies. This story unfolds in the world of Western stories, where betrayal, redemption, and the struggle for survival are constant themes. As the two protagonists confront their darkest moments, they discover that true redemption comes not from running away from the past, but from confronting it head-on. Their journey through treacherous terrain and battlefields echoes the timeless themes of Western stories, where honor, strength, and survival are key. The warrior, once broken by past choices, must reconcile with the man he once was, and the woman by his side must face her own demons as they navigate a world fraught with danger. This is not just a fight for survival, it's a fight for the future, a future they hope to build from the ashes of their past. The tale unfolds through a series of intense, emotionally charged moments that capture the essence of Western stories, showing the relentless pursuit of peace and justice in an unforgiving land. As they reach the final confrontation, the warrior and the woman must decide whether they will let their past define them or break free to create their own destiny. In the end, this narrative, steeped in the tradition of Western stories, proves that even in the harshest environments, the human spirit can endure, and redemption is possible through courage, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of what is right.